Okay, good morning. Firstly, before I begin, could everyone just turn off the mics? Okay, so good morning. My name is Terry and I am one of the project managers at UN Global Compact Norway. Today we have our reporting event, which will be on science-based targets. Firstly, thank you so much for availing time for this reporting event and actually coming online for this. So this reporting network is a functioning network which we have at UN Global Compact. And what we want to do with this network is we want to hear from other companies and learn from each other about what they're currently doing within their networks. It is something that we're hoping to have every single month, and starting off this month with something on science-based targets. So firstly, we will have Kim Gabrielli, who is the Executive Director of UN Global Compact Norway, who will give us opening remarks and also just tell us about why companies should report.
Good morning, everyone. We are delighted, of course, to do this event together with WWF Norway. And first of all, just a big congratulations on the telethon. 228 million NOK without use going out to people, Fredrik. That is fantastic. I think we should just applaud that, all of us, for such a good cause as the ocean, of course. So as you can see, we even have the goal here with us today. So thank you so much, Norway and WWF, of course. I'm not going to spend much time here. I just want to say thank you to all our members coming here today, Telenor, Atea, Semasis, and of course KLP, to join us on some discussions on the science-based targets. We are, as always, talking up the importance of reporting, but in order to do reporting, we need to set good goals, and that is what science-based targets is all about, right? And you will get a very good sort of intro from WWF, as well as from the perspective of the companies that are here with us today. Let me just end by saying that there's a couple of events we want to inform you about. First of all, we have UN Days on we are celebrating the UN Day on the 23rd of October, so this Friday. Officially it's on Saturday, but we thought perhaps you would join us on Friday instead this year. And on Monday we have our largest event this year. So the Nordic Future of Business Summit, our UN Global Compact Nordic meeting this year, is hosted by us in Oslo. And we have big speakers from Standa, the head of UN Global Compact globally, Robert Strand, the head of responsible business at the Berkeley University. We have politicians from all over the Nordics, and we also have CEOs from some of the largest companies in our countries. So we both have Schibsted and ST1 Nordic and Alecta from Sweden. Hopefully you all have time to join us on Monday. You find all the information on our homepage, globalcompact.no. With those words, I just hand it back to you, Terry, and you will take us through the day.
Thank you so much, Kim, for that introduction. So I will not waste any time. Firstly, we have WWF, who will be speaking on what science-based targets are. From WWF, we have Fredrik, who will be speaking. He is the Senior Policy Advisor at WWF. He has worked both with policy and business to develop deep decarbonization strategies and new sustainable business models, touching on intersection between policy, technology, and innovation. Thank you, Fredrik, for being one of our speakers, and I'm going to hand over to you now.
Thank you. I'm just going to get my presentation up. There you go. Can you see my presentation now?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes. Great. Okay, Terry, Kim, thank you for the introduction, and thank you for hosting this event. I'm here on behalf of WWF, and we're very happy with the TV action, and we're just now starting to settle down after the weekend. And it's honestly quite nice to talk about something that is not related to TV Aksjon, to get done business as usual, you might say. So I'll be giving you an overview of the Science-Based Targets Initiative. the concept, its background, the current status for implementation, and some of the way forward. Hear more from the others about their experiences with SBTIs and how and why they set them. So yeah, some background. The initiative was launched in 2015 by Carbon Disclosure Project, UNGC, WRI, and WWF. It's a lot of acronyms there. The initiative was aimed originally to address the gap between the Paris goals and the ambition that was observed in the corporate sector. There was at the time an increasing awareness of climate change and its consequences, but not quite enough understanding what the various climate change scenarios means for corporates and corporate climate target setting. So the hope was that by creating an independent standard for embedding the Paris Agreement into corporate governance, it could help to leverage kind of corporate action on climate change, working for a long-term vision where SBTIs become a standard business practice, and then allow companies and corporations to play a critical role in the transition towards a zero carbon economy. So don't worry, I will try to unpack a little bit more exactly what this means. Like in the briefest of terms, SBTIs is based on the global carbon budget compatible with the Paris Agreement. Emissions are associated with economic activity. Like just as with GDP contribution, carbon emissions, they can be traced back to individual companies or sectors, thus providing a key for allocating their individual share of the carbon budget. This is then used as a basis for setting a target and abatement curve that are compliant with the respective share of the budget and also the Paris Agreement targets. So you get kind of, you allocate the big budget to each individual corporation. I just saw the quote underneath the graph here, which equates SBTs to nationally determined contributions of the Paris Agreement. But in fact, it can be argued that SBTs actually go a lot further, as they are based in the actual carbon budget compared to the NDCs that are based on voluntary national contributions and does not necessarily reflect the actual responsibility of a country or a target that is sufficient to reach the 2-degree climate global warming target of the Paris Agreement. So the commitment we're seeing by corporates on SBTs is actually quite a lot stronger than what we see from countries in the Paris Agreement. So that's kind of good from the corporate sector, and something to be proud of, I would say. So there's two general approaches to setting a target. The first, absolute contraction-based approach, kind of a complicated terminology for an easy concept, because in an absolute contraction-based approach, the percentage reduction in absolute emissions required under a given scenario is applied to all companies equally, regardless of sector. It's kind of a flat division. The SBTI is currently using the IPCC Special Report on Global Warming of 1.5 degree, the SR15, to create two pathways. One is a well below 2 degree pathway, and the second one is a 1.5 degree pathway. In carbon reduction terms, this equates to at least 2.5% absolute reduction per year for well below 2 degree alignment, or a 4.2% absolute reduction per year for 1.5 degree alignment. So that's 4.2 for 1.5 and 2.5 for 2 degree alignment. Like an absolute target, it's easier to set because it's a flat division regardless of companies or sector. But the con with this is that it's less fine-grained to the particularities of the given sector, for instance, finance or which covers a wide range of different businesses and sectors, or oil and gas, which has very particular emission challenges, or agriculture, which is characterized by kind of complex emission profile and natural carbon sinks that can offset emission. So, I mean, all the sectors vary, and their decarbonization pathways will then naturally be different. So SBTi has also sought to develop kind of sectoral decarbonization approaches, SDAs, which is based on a sector-specific decarbonization pathway, which is aligned with the beyond 2 degree scenario developed by the IEA. So then you have kind of an emission reduction pathway, which is allocated, like you take the carbon budget, but you kind of distribute it according to the emission pathway, a reduction pathway of your sector, and then you take the sector kind of profile and divide it on the companies in the sector. You get kind of like an abatement curve that is more adapted to the actual decarbonization pathway which your company will follow. So it provides more kind of flexibility and more kind of nuance to the target setting. But it still reaches the overall 2 degree or 1.5 degree goal. So, I mean, the end result will be the same. In this regard, SBTi kind of fills in a gap in what I call the corporate reporting jungle, because it provides kind of a substantive initiative such as GRI or CDP, which provides standards and principles for how to report, but does not provide any means of evaluating the content that is reported. I.e., you can have great reporting, but you can still perform really badly on SDGs or on carbon emission reductions. It also provides a more dynamic way of expressing climate risk and the greenness of assets and companies. For example, the EU taxonomy, which classifies green versus non-green based on a thorough review of industry or existing industry emission profiles. Like, this is fixed in time, whereas SBTIs, they take a longer term and express an individual company's intention to do something about their emissions. For example, you could say in the case of steel or cement industry, which is today not particularly green, but some companies still display quite a lot of commitment to deep decarbonization, and this might change quite rapidly, or at least until 2050, try to become carbon neutral. So, like, I'm going to go a little bit quickly through this, as we'll hear more from Seamus and others about how the process of setting a target and committing a target. But SBTi is set up so you sign to commit, after which a process is started with SBTIs or external consultants or on your own, where you develop a target using the various SBTi tools and guidelines. So SBTi provides external validation and assurance, because they have to validate all the targets that are submitted and make sure they are compliant with SBTi standard. After which it has been approved to be compliant, it is announced publicly and provides a measure of accountability as well as inspiration for others. WWF, as a global partner, is mostly, or we're involved globally with all aspects of SBTi. We provide a lot of expertise in developing sectoral guidance and scenarios. We also help with corporate outreach, provide training and advice, or use SBTi actively in corporate partnership work. But WWF Norway has until now been mostly active in developing sectoral guidance. For instance, we've contributed to oil and gas guidelines and finance guidelines, which were recently published. However, we're also opening in our most recent strategy new ways of deepening corporate work, where SBTIs can potentially play a bigger role in our work going forward, depending a little bit on the interest in SBTIs in the corporate sector. So we'll see how it goes. So a little bit short now before we move on. The progress of SBTIs globally has seen quite a lot of development. We now have over 1,000 committed companies that are committed and 460 targets that are approved. The company is spread across 60 different countries, 50 sectors. This gives the market capitalization of $15.4 trillion US, including 1/5 of global Fortune 500. In money terms, this is hard to kind of make out, but in carbon terms, SBTI covers more than 10% of global emissions, which is really like a good sign of progress. In the Nordics, we have nearly 100 committed companies and quite a strong participation, where Sweden is currently ranking as #1 with 40 companies committed. Sweden has been taking a lead early on, with IKEA and IKEA Foundation being a founding participant and financial supporter. And they also have big multinationals such as IKEA and H&M, which has provided a great signal effect for corporate sector as a whole. Also, Denmark and Finland has had a lot of engagement. They're comparable in size to Norway, but has nearly twice as many SBTIs. A quick analysis here can be that a lot of the businesses that are committed in Denmark and Finland have a multinational presence, and they're more consumer oriented. So they might have a different stakeholder expectation. Because of course you want your Carlsberg beer to be compatible with the Paris objectives. And then Norway comes in at last place with only 12 committed companies, which is bad. But the good news is that even though we started out slow, we're now seeing quite a rapid catch up in Norway. So we're hoping that Norway can start catching up to the Nordic neighbors. So in Norway, we started out we've had quite a lot of our sustainability champions like KLP who signed up very early. But despite this, perhaps more sector-specific guidance, or the lack of sector-specific guidance, may have stalled wider participation. You could see particularly the case for petroleum or shipping industry, which didn't have any sectoral guidance, and then had few entries into SBTIs. This is quite ironic, as they're perhaps the most exposed to what you could say transition risk. And this makes reporting quite essential for oil and gas companies. Many have therefore taken kind of a stronger individual relationship over target setting, which might be good for the individual company, but it's hard for external stakeholders to unpack and compare targets when every company developed their own methodology. You have to be a climate scientist to understand the methodology developed by Equinor for their target setting, and for Shell and BP, which are all different. So SBTI, we're now working on a new oil and gas standard, which can hopefully make it a little bit easier to kind of align target setting in the industry. Yeah. So this is, we're going to wrap up now, but I just wanted to show you, this is the working plan for the new sectoral foundations that we're working on in the global network. So you can see we have shipping, we have oil and gas coming up. We just published one on financial institutions, which I'm sure we'll hear more about from KLP. So there's going to be a lot of progress there, which we hope will kind of boost the participation in Norway. We also have a new guidance out for setting net zero targets, which is also becoming more relevant as we're now approaching 2030 rapidly. So we see more corporations setting net zero targets for 2050 as we're kind of, it becomes more visible that we're heading in that direction. And the net zero target methodology it follows the same, but it's more guidance on, you could say, how to deal with residual emissions, how to deal with offsetting, how to deal with negative emissions, or carbon storage, which can be quite important for energy companies, oil and gas companies, agriculture, waste management, all the sectors where you have opportunities for capturing or even creating negative emissions. So we hope that more corporates are setting these net zero targets going forward. And lastly, this is last from us, WWF. We of course have to end with a call to action for TV-aksjonen, because this is still open until November 1st. So in case anyone didn't notice or supported the TV-aksjonen, you can still join in. So thank you. That was all from us today.
Thank you, Fredrik, for that interesting introduction and overview on science-based targets. Now we'll have an introduction from KLP, who we have Lars-Erik Mangset, who will be speaking on why science-based target initiative is important for financial actors. Lars is the Chief Advisor on Climate Change in KLP, focusing on Inter-Allies Paris Agreement, climate risk, and green investments. He has previously held positions within Applied Research and Consultant in DNVGL and as Conservation Advisor in WWF. So to Lars, I say welcome, and once again, thank you for coming on board this program and actually helping us with our reporting event.
Thanks very much for that introduction. I'm not so acquainted with Zoom, so how do I share a screen?
So you will see there is a button that says share screen.
Ah, there. Okay, that was
Yeah.
pretty clear. Okay,
Perfect.
Great. Yeah, so thanks for that introduction, and thanks also for Fredrik. It was a very interesting background there on science-based targets. Now, as noted, it's quite recent that the guidance for the financial sector was published, and we are in the midst of working on towards setting a science-based target for our investments. So I'm not able to present anything of this yet because it's work in progress. But what I will try to do is to share some reflection about how things looks from where we are, and I will talk a little bit about at the end some of the work we are doing within the target setting space and calculating our emission inventory. I'll start with a very fundamental perspective, and that is, of course, that as we see the sort of like climate change agenda is on the rise, and more and more companies are seeing merits in integrating climate change in their strategy, and pushing the acceleration of the transition. Green has become perhaps even commercially more interesting lately. So it's the case also for us as a financial actor and investor, and this is, I think, the case for many of our peers here in Norway and in Scandinavia and in the world in general, that more and more investors are becoming concerned about the climate change development, and they are moving climate change as part of their priority in their strategy. So the very, very fundamental question for an investor such as KLP, we have an exposure to 7,000 companies globally, is of course how we can judge the climate profile of companies we invest in. Now, there is a lot of new data that is emerging and many new startups that is coming into the field of providing sustainability data in general, but also climate change related data specifically. And there are many different ways that we can try to characterize the green profile of companies. But I think a very fundamental one is still emissions and the development or the target setting of the emissions and the extent to which companies will align their emissions with the Paris Agreement and using scientific benchmarks to sort of like verify that they are doing the right thing. Ideally, and maybe sometimes in the future, all companies in the world will have an emission target. but we are not there. And Fredrik showed the uptake of science-based target, which has a very impressive uptake lately. And we also support that more and more companies should adhere to the science-based targets. I'll just show you this graph, and this is an analysis of the MSCI World Index. So that is an index that consists of 1,600 companies in OECD markets predominantly. And it's, just think of it as a very central index that is used by many actors in the financial community and many of the largest companies or the larger companies in the world. So this graph has two axes. If you look at the black line, first, if you look at the different names in the bottom, that shows the different sectors. So we aggregated the companies in different sectors. The black lines show the emission in that sector. So for instance, for utilities, which has the highest emissions, that sector in total in MSCI World Index emit about 2,000 million ton CO2. Materials, about around 1,500 million ton CO2, and etc. The bar in, I think it's red, shows the number of companies that have actually set an emission reduction target in that sector. So you can see, for instance, for household and personal products, is over 90% of the companies in that sector that have set the targets. And you see it vary a little bit. But as the emissions in the sector increase, we see actually a tendency, I would say, visually, that less companies are actually setting targets. So of MSCI World, there is about 1/3 that have set some sort of targets. Now, what is very interesting, and what is a tool which I can give you a little sample of now, a tool than others, and which is now an official tool for apply under the science-based target for financial institutions, is that we can now take the targets that is set by these companies, and we can convert that to what is called a temperature score. So a temperature score would say whether a company is working for a 2-degree warming, 3-degree warming, 2.5, etc. You're just taking the targets and you are comparing that to the IPCC scenarios for 1.5-degree warming. So if you look at the, this graph, we show the temperature score for the 4 top emitting sector that was shown in the previous graph. And on the axis, it goes from 1.5 to 3.2. So 3.2 is the assumed as the business as usual warming. So if a company doesn't set the target, they are working for a 3.2 world in the model. And then a Paris level will be below here. So not surprisingly, as we can see, for the 4 high emitting sectors, really none of them are not even getting close to, as a group together, towards meeting also the requirements that will be part of the science-based targets. Now, one thing is, of course, the quantity, like how many companies are setting goals, but it's also the way that the goals are set. This shows some example from the CDP reporting in 2019. And in the CDP report, from our perspective then, as a diversified investor, we have access to all the different company responses, and we have had a look at the way that companies are actually expressing their targets. And I just wanted to give you a couple of examples here. So the one is in green, relates to an absolute target, and that's pretty fairly easy to interpret. But things becomes a lot more interesting and perhaps a little bit more challenging when there are different ways of expressing it. You have CO2 over kilowatt hours, CO2 over flights, CO2 over petabyte, CO2 over ton cement, or square meters. And then these are fairly understandable, but then it becomes a little bit more difficult when you say CO2 over square meter retail common area, or revenue ton kilometers, or modified TEU. TEU is container freight. But what modified TEU means, it's I'm not sure. And this is exactly the point that Fredrik made earlier, which I think is the important one, and especially for a financial institution is that if there's a lack of harmonization in the way that companies are setting targets, it is not only difficult to really understand how good the target a company is setting, how ambitious it is, but it can also be difficult to compare companies between different companies. And I think that's very important, especially for financial institutions, because we see now, for instance, that we have a very interesting or very attractive valuation of green assets. Green companies on the Oslo Stock Exchange is doing very well. We also see more financial products which are used in the market. So really to be able to understand how well a company is doing on the emission side and how they are comparing to others is really critical. And this is, of course, why we have got the science-based target. This is also why KLP was very early in supporting the science-based target, because we believe there is a need for standardization in the market, especially now that we see sort of like the commercial aspect of the greenness in the market, so to speak, is definitely on the rise. And there are more and more actors that is entering into this space. So just to share some reflection on the science-based target in itself. I think that I've just made that point, is that we need standardizations to be able to know whether we are moving in the right direction. And it's really valuable to have standards such as science-based targets because it's follow reasonable scientific benchmarks, and it's a standard. So everyone that applies for it needs to have some sort of harmonization. Of course, moving forward, and I guess it's a good day at work for Philip in WWF and other, is maybe the day we won't need the science-based targets anymore, because we are now getting the EU taxonomy, which is more or less requiring data that is necessary for us to connect a company's performance to overall climate ambitions and scientific benchmarks, as mentioned about it many times already. So the effect of EU taxonomy will be quite interesting in this space, because it will require reporting from companies based in EU, and hopefully will also pollinate in requiring that companies outside the EU will also provide this data in the future. So maybe we will come to this place where we will have data on listed companies that enables us from an external point of view to assess whether or not they are following science-based pathways. And I also want to say that, we have been early supporters of science-based targets. We are participating now in a campaign where we are encouraging more companies to sign up for the science-based target. So this is a very important issue for us. But we also need to acknowledge that there is a standard that will be further developed. And the quality of the sectoral guidance, in our view, vary. For instance, if you take a look at the real estate criteria that is used in science-based targets, you are basically you are making a global benchmark on the energy use of buildings. And in effect, you are then comparing Norwegian buildings that is run mostly on hydropower and wind energy and renewable energy with buildings in, say, areas with a higher share of fossil and coal in their mix. And we also think that the finance guidelines, it's an extremely good start, but there are also some challenges there that I won't go more into in this presentation. But what is important for us in general is that this is an extremely complex area, and we don't believe in waiting for the perfect methodology and data before we commit and start our work towards adhering to it. So our view is that, yes, I mean, we know this is very complicated. It will be difficult to make a standard that will please and suit everyone, but we will still initiate our work and try to get the verification of the science-based target nonetheless, and then improve over time. So I will say a little bit about our approach.
Sorry, just 2 minutes till roundup.
Okay, I will be very quick. So we have not been able to sign up for science-based targets before because the guideline just came out. We do have a goal of reducing our own emissions from our own operations with 50% from in 2030 relative to 2010. I think we're down 37% already. But of course, it's not KLP scope 1 and 2 emissions that matters, it's our scope 3. And most of our emissions is related from our investments. We have had a quite good development in our carbon footprint and carbon intensity since 2010. So basically, for instance, every million invested in KLP before gave almost 300 tons CO2, and it's now down in 122. We have increased our absolute emissions with 25%, but at the same time, we have increased the money that we manage with 350%. So we sort of like have, I don't want to use the word decoupling, but we are certainly become a lot more we have improved our carbon intensity in the way that we manage our investment quite significantly. And it's not only due to stuff that the KLP have done, for instance, divesting from coal and oil sand, is also because the market in itself is decarbonizing. So we can't take credit for all of this. I just want to, we are working towards aligning what we call our Paris alignment work, where we hopefully will get an approval for our climate target setting by science-based targets. That remains to be seen, but we will at least try that. We will be very transparent in the way that we are trying to align ourselves with Paris, and we will release a report that will be open to everyone, that will really give you a lot of details of the way that we're thinking, and share some of the challenges that we have experienced. What is really important for us now is that we are in the process of doing that, and we have come quite far, is to try to calculate the emissions from all our investments, everything. We need to set sensible targets that make sense externally, so that we can show that we are actually anchoring this in scientific benchmark. But I think also importantly that we have the right decision-making foundation to make decisions internally. And we need to be able, and this is a challenge that we experience, the ability for us to actually measure the company's climate performance in a good way. And that affects the asset allocation implication for KLP. We need to, and I think that this is definitely on the rise, we need to focus on the impacts and not only cosmetics. So we are, for instance, getting challenged a lot by academics for our policy to divest from coal. And they are saying that it won't have any effect. And I think that kind of discussion, and more of the similar type of discussion about how do we actually, like, we can always divest ourselves out from the problem or do something else, but what will actually have an effect on the market. So just two final points, Tarja. We need to handle that the science-based targets and this whole field, the EU taxonomy, the data availability, everything is really moving rapidly. And we need to have focus on continuous development. We're not going to land the perfect solution now, but we need to have sequential improvements towards later on have a as credible approach as possible to showcase our contribution to the Paris goal. So I'll stop there, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Lars, for that. And it is interesting. It's also our goal here at UN Global Compact that companies do set and target. And it is also interesting to see the top emitting sectors. So without wasting much time, we'll have our next speaker, who will be from Telenor, and Telenor will be speaking about their experience with the science-based targets. From Telenor, we have Elizabeth, who is the Vice President in Sustainability in the Telenor Group. Just give us a minute. Sorry about that.
Hi, I'm Elisabeth Bjerring, and I'm working in Telenor Group in the Sustainability Division. I'm very sorry not to be able to attend the session today, but I've recorded this short video and will share an update with you on Telenor's CO2 reduction targets and the background for setting these targets, how we're working with the Science-Based Target Initiative, and I'll also share some of our challenges and reflections from our ongoing work. So first, on our targets. Within the mobile sector, the industry and key industry organizations have worked together to define a pathway for what type of targets the industry need to set as a minimum to align with the targets of the Paris Agreement. This industry pathway have been set in collaboration with the SBTi and also approved by the SBTi. And this input was very valuable when we set our targets earlier this year. Telenor's ambition for Nordic market is to have carbon neutral operations by 2030, and our ambition for our Asian operation is a 50% reduction in carbon emissions by 2030. We've set individual targets for these two regions that we are operating in due to the differences in access to clean energy. Our big challenge is, one of our biggest challenges, the lack of access to clean energy in our Asian markets. We will work on this, explore and collaborate together with local governments and with partners to see how we can contribute to increasing the access to clean energy. This includes seeking opportunities for power purchasing agreements and also using solar solutions for base station to a larger degree. These targets, especially for Asia, are stretch targets, but we believe they are achievable. Technology and energy markets are developing very quickly, and I think our strategy needs to be flexible in order to accommodate for new solutions as they become available over the coming years. So where are we in terms of the SBTi process? Last February, we sent in our SBTi commitment letter, and we're now working on specification of our targets, defining roadmaps to achieve these targets, and on submitting the targets for validation by SBTi. We have set clear targets for CO2 reduction for Scope 1 and Scope 2, and we're now working on setting targets for Scope 3 that will pass the SBTi validation process. I've been asked to reflect on some challenges and learnings so far. And first of all, our biggest challenge is the lack of access to clean energy in Asia. But then on another level, and related to the SBTi requirements and framework, as mentioned, we are working on screening our Scope 3 emissions, also defining the targets to be submitted, and how to report on this. And this has been and is challenging. In our Scope 3 screening work, we have used the SBTi recommended Scope 3 screening tool, and that has been helpful. However, our experience is that there is really limited, robust and updated data on sector and company-specific emissions. For example, the sector emission intensity data in the Scope 3 evaluator has not been updated since 2016. So there's a lack of robust data, and we see that our peers and our competitors are doing this screening and calculations in several different ways, which is making it quite hard to compare. I believe this is still an area that are in shaping, but I see a need for further guidance in this area and standards to effectively execute and report on Scope 3. In terms of learnings and reflections, I have 3 that I'll share with you. 1, don't underestimate the importance of involving the right people internally, including finance, strategy, technology, to mention a few, when setting targets, defining roadmaps, and agreeing on roles and responsibilities for implementing targets. 2, having the industry pathway that was approved by SBTi has been a great help when defining and setting targets. 3, learn from others and share your own experience. we have been able to learn a lot from our peers, from the early movers, and I've really experienced a great willingness from our competitors to share experience and to discuss solutions. Finally, collaboration within our industry, within value chain is key. And this will support the domino effect that will help accelerate the adoption of SBTs and the systematic emission reductions. So that was my few minutes of insight.
Okay, so that was from Telenor. And next up, we'll have Atea. From Atea, they'll be also speaking on their experience with the science-based targets. We have Andreas, who is the Director of Corporate Responsibility for the Atea Group and the Head of Sustainability in Atea Denmark. Thank you so much, Andreas, and I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, hi. So greetings from, can you hear me first? Yeah, excellent. No, but greetings from a small room in Copenhagen this morning. I don't have any presentation to share today, but I will try to explain what we have done in Atea for the last few years. So basically, for those who doesn't know, Atea is an IT company. We have 90 offices throughout the Nordics and Baltics. It is listed on the Oslo Stock Exchange, about 35 billion NOK revenue per year. Long story short, we sincerely believe that IT will play a crucial role the coming decade when it comes to meeting global challenges. And that is what our new 2030 plan is all about. And of course, we have a climate target in our 2030 plan as well. And we also have a scope 4 emission target in that plan as well, which is quite funny, I think. But when it comes to science-based targets, it all started 2017, if I remember correctly. I had a meeting with KLP, actually, a colleague with Lars, probably, Jeanette Bergan, I think her name is. And we had a discussion about climate policies and climate targets and so on. And she asked me that, okay, Andreas, do you know if, do we have any climate policy at Atea? And I said, yeah. No, we don't, but we should have that, of course. So that was actually the first step. So back in 2017, we developed the first climate policy for the Atea Group. And at the same time, we had a discussion internally about, okay, maybe we should have a joint climate target as well, because as of then, we have businesses in Norway, Denmark, Sweden, and so on. So until 2017, most countries had their, local targets. But we decided that we should have a joint target. And I know that Semasys will talk later as well. And that was quite funny because I asked Semasys, and we had a discussion with Semasys, and they said that, yeah, maybe you should look into the science-based target. And at that point, I didn't know about it, but so yeah, let's do that. So I think that Atea is one of the first companies globally that has an approved science-based target, at least top 100, I would say. So Semasys actually helped us developing this. They have helped us since 2010 with the carbon footprint reports. It made sense to have them help us with the science-based target as well. So back in 2018, we had an approved science-based target, which is it's minus 43%. That is our target for 2030. But we decided to, since it's hard to communicate minus 43%, we said that, yeah, let's aim for minus 50%, like other companies do. So we have a target of minus 50%. And I think this target would be maybe one of the most short-lived targets that we have ever set, because we expected to reach it when we have made, assumptions on the future that we may reach it like 2025, 2026. But as I mentioned, this plan that we have was approved in March this year. And then we had COVID-19. And we have seen, we can actually measure the carbon footprint real time, since we have been connected to, travel agencies and so on. We can see the carbon emissions. So without saying too much, I think this target will be updated next year or year after, because we will see a significant effect on our carbon emissions. And I was kind of laughing when I heard the previous speaker, because she said that, yeah, you need to anchor it, internally. yes, you have, because it took me a year to anchor it. So we had a science-based target, and then it took some time, you know, to anchor it with all the people saying that, you know, this is not rocket science. So when it comes to recommendations, I would say that try not using too much words like scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, because people not working with climate or environment, it gets a bit academic. And I could tell by introducing the scope 4 emissions internally, it was like, yeah, it's it doesn't have to be academic. Just keep it, you know, keep it straight, keep it simple. It isn't that hard to develop the target as such, and just having a, you know, proper roadmap showing the management team saying that, yeah, if we do those things, we will reach the target. It's not rocket science. So that's my recommendation. Keep not being so academic about it, because we can be it when we have this kind of conversations, but internally not very successful, I think. What else can I say? No, but as I mentioned, so if you want to know more about the 2030 plan, it's on our website. And as I mentioned, I think this target for most companies will be quite short-lived. What I can add is that we have intentionally focused on only communicating about the minor absolute emissions. So we don't say anything about climate positive or climate neutral or carbon zero or whatever. We have chosen to communicate about the emission targets, and at the same time we do invest in climate projects like in Norway and so on, but we have chosen to focus in our plan just to reduce our own emissions. So we don't use any of those phrases intentionally. So that's short from Mattia, and if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. And thanks to KLP for reaching out, 2017 about the climate policy. That was great. Yeah, so that's from Mattia.
Yeah, and thank you so much for that. It was really interesting to get your experiences and your advice about how to go about it. So now we'll have our last speaker for the day, who is Sophie from Semesis. They'll be speaking about hitting the mark with science-based targets. Sophie is a senior consultant at Semesis, specializing in climate risk and science-based target setting. Her background is in environmental policy and regulation from the London School of Economics, with previous experience in policy development and green economy analysis at the United Nations. Thank you so much, Sophie, and I'll hand it over to you now.
Thank you. I hope everyone can hear me okay and see my screen. Just give me a little nod if yes, or a shake if no. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, okay, great, thanks. Okay, so hi, and thank you for that introduction, Terry, and to the other speakers for really great insight. In the last 20 minutes, I will run through the science behind science-based targets, how to develop them, and why companies should align their targets and strategy with the latest climate change science. So my name is Sophie Rusko-Jewett, as Terry just said, and I am a senior consultant at Semesis. Just as a quick orientation, for those of you who are not familiar with Semesis, we are a consulting firm. We were among the first in the Nordics to be fully specialized on climate change and sustainability. We started in 2007, so a while back, and today we have around 400 Nordic and international clients. So we combine a system of advanced system solutions for all types of ESG work, but right now we're talking about climate change, so we have a carbon footprint tool. We also have a reporting tool that goes with GRI, for example. And we have a stakeholder survey tool, or an ESG survey tool, which is for supplier, for following up your suppliers and, for example, emissions in your supply chain. So we combine that system service with consulting expertise, and one of the areas where we have been very much involved from the start is science-based targets. So right now, for example, we're trying to find system solutions for the new finance sector methodology. So like was mentioned earlier, the temperature rating tool, for example. So today I'm just going to go quickly through what it means to set emission reduction targets and how to align these types of targets with science. And then we will look at what methodologies and criteria are required for companies when setting science-based targets. And I'll also go into how setting science-based targets can lead to benefits for businesses and how companies are using these targets as centerpieces in their sustainability strategies. So for context, I would like to begin by exploring how companies have traditionally set emission reduction targets. It's already been mentioned a little bit how these targets were really hard to compare and to really know if they were good enough, quote unquote, when it comes to mitigating climate change and the impacts that entails. So setting emission reduction targets is nothing new or revolutionary. Companies have set targets to reduce emissions and energy use for many years. And this process applies for any type of emission reduction target, really. The first thing that is necessary when you're going to set such a target is, of course, to measure greenhouse gas emissions from company activities. In recent years, it has also become normal to measure and set targets for emissions in the broader value chain, so scope 3, not to get too technical. But and then second, companies need to outline possible measures to take and set targets for how much they want to reduce and how fast. Lastly, the targets need to be integrated into strategy and communicated both internally and externally. However, the rate of reduction, both in amount and in speed, was largely an arbitrary one. So companies usually set these targets based on already established operational strategies, for example, and this made it really difficult to evaluate whether targets indicate that companies are doing, quote unquote, enough, and it makes it difficult to compare emission reduction ambitions across companies. So but this is to say that the company strategy of emission reduction might look something like this, which looks ambitious enough, but there's really no way to gauge the quality of such a goal when it cannot be compared to a standard. So in many cases, company strategy was not ambitious enough and couldn't be benchmarked, and it was definitely not designed for long-term target development. So when we look at the reduction required to mitigate climate change, these traditional targets were far off from what was required, and the climate action, as the climate action is becoming top of mind with stakeholders, especially I'd say customers and investors, the targets are also far off from what was expected from and demanded from these stakeholders. So just to touch on that a little bit, we had KLP also telling us how they evaluate companies on this, and that is another way to say that stakeholders want to understand the climate change strategy of companies they're investing in or buying from, and they want to know that these companies are taking appropriate action. So the strength of SBTs is that they provide a framework that allows companies to go beyond intention to actually taking action. External benchmarking indices are placing increasing pressure on companies to build and disclose SBTs, which will affect the performance scores in various reporting schemes as well. Most importantly, I'd say that SBTs demonstrate strategic long-term thinking and leadership, which can reinforce positive reputation with investors and customers. So many companies, recognizing the risk of climate change to their business and the opportunity it creates for leadership and innovation, have set emission reduction targets. So to date, most company targets do not match the ambition and timelines consistent with the 1.5 degree future or even the 2 degree future. So this leads us to the science-based targets and the Science-Based Target Initiative. Already been mentioned that this is a partnership between CDP, UN Global Compact, WWF, and World Resource Institute, and that they offer pathways, tools, and advice for businesses from all sectors. This was also, I think it's important to mention again, a reaction to the Paris Agreement with the intention of increasing the corporate ambition on climate action by mobilizing companies to set targets in line with the science for keeping global warming below 2 degrees. So I just want to quickly touch on what that science actually says. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change provides policymakers with regular scientific assessment on the current state of climate change and its potential environmental and socioeconomic impacts. The IPCC identifies where there is agreement in the scientific community on topics related to climate change and is therefore considered the scientific authority on the matter. The science presented by the IPCC shows that the scientists are united in the understanding that man-made climate change poses devastating risks to the health of humans and ecosystems. So this figure shows that the global mean surface temperature in the late 1800s compared to the early 2000s, and shows an alarming rise, which impacts and disrupts nearly all natural cycles on which our societies really depend. And I just want to mention also that the IPCC 6th assessment cycle is underway, and that the synthesis report is due for release in 2022. And I'm sure we're all climate nerds looking forward to seeing what they have to say on that. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC, is the United Nations entity supporting the global political response to climate change. And this is also the parent treaty, which the Paris Agreement falls under. And the Paris Agreement had the central aim of strengthening the global response to the threat of climate change by keeping global temperature rise this century to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and then to pursue efforts to limit the temperature even further to 1.5 degrees. So beyond 1.5, the world will increasingly experience a dangerous climate impact and humanitarian crises linked to drought, sea level rise, flooding, extreme heat, and ecosystem collapse. So the figure here shows, the black line shows the historical emissions, and then the yellow line actually is the commitments that came out of the Paris Agreement. And if we see here, it really doesn't get us anywhere close to where we need to be, which is below 2 degrees, as close to 1.5 as we can get. So we really need to be in these bottom pathways here. So the Paris Agreement just isn't enough. It's not ambitious enough. We need companies to set targets that go way beyond that. So in recent years, we have seen how politicians react to this alarming science put forth by the IPCC, and they are ratcheting up their ambitions quickly. In fact, in November of last year, the EU Parliament declared a climate emergency, which has played an important role in pushing for more ambitious EU climate legislation. And just earlier this month, the European Parliament actually raised the reduction ambition to 60% instead of the 55% which had been proposed by the EU Commission. And Norway also has increased their target from 40% to 55% in 2030 from their base year of 1990. So this just shows that politicians really are acting on IPCC reports and call for immediate reductions for emissions. The original targets will likely be reviewed and updated in the coming years, becoming just more and more ambitious. We see here that the green line is projections with existing measures, and the yellow line is projections with additional measures. And the target, the EU target at that, that we thought was going to be the EU target in 2030 is already closer to 55 or 60% reduction. And that just means that companies need to follow, what are the governments saying, what are the national targets, and need to ratchet up their ambitions just as much. And so we can see that the increase in ambition level will have big impacts on the socioeconomic pathways that companies have to consider in their
Did you disappear?
Here, I'm sorry, I think I disappeared.
Yes, you did.
I'm back. Here, let me just share my screen again. Can you see my screen?
Yes, now we can see it again.
Okay, so sorry about that. I'll just jump right back in. So the question then, based on what I've just said, is that how can companies align themselves with this IPCC science and be in line with these national targets as well? So the targets adopted by companies to reduce emissions are considered science-based if they are in line with the level of decarbonization required to keep global temperature increase below 2 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels. Again, Paris commitments really aren't enough. We need to be considering the carbon budget that is left for us to reach the below 2 degree pathway. Okay, so setting science-based targets requires a structured process based on a chosen methodology and a set of criteria to meet. But I also want to stress, just as was mentioned earlier, it isn't rocket science, and it shouldn't be something that seems too difficult to do. You just need to do it in a structured way, involve the right people, and follow obviously the best practice laid out by the methodology. So when we work with our clients to set science-based targets, this is our basic process. So first, we map and measure a company's greenhouse gas emissions according to the greenhouse gas protocol, which is an international standard for carbon accounting. And not to get too technical, but there are 3 scopes: scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. And so one of the most important steps here is to conduct a thorough scope 3 assessment and a screening of the emissions involved in the upstream and downstream value chain. And then you should also have a system for following the emissions up every year in a consistent manner. And the scope 3 emissions are important because that is often where the majority of a company's emissions lie, and therefore you have to consider these emissions in order to make sure that a company's entire emission landscape is covered in your target. So then we evaluate the various methodological approaches, which we've already have introduced. And these depend, I mean, the choice of which depends slightly on which industry you're in, but basically means choosing between absolute or intensity target setting. And the 3 most important ones or most common ones are listed here. There's obviously new ones for the finance sector, which we've also touched on. But no matter what approach is chosen, the aggregate reduction must be the same. So third, we map a company's planned and potential, or sorry, third, we use a model for scenario analysis that we have developed based on the SBT methodology in order to visualize our client's carbon budget over time. And then finally, we map a company's planned and potential reduction initiatives to see how much a company must reduce and when these reduction measures must be put in place in order to meet their science-based target. So in our experience, that becomes the best practice way to truly anchor the target in realistic measures, which makes it better integrated in strategic and financial planning. So the Science-Based Target Initiative has a manual with both criteria and recommendations. So here are some of the most important criteria to consider when developing your target. The target must cover a minimum of 5 years and a maximum of 15 years. This is the requirement, but the initiative also encourages long-term targets more than 15 years into the future until 2050. The SBTI recommends choosing the most recent years for which data is available as your base year. So if you set a target in 2020, you should use the base year 2019. And this is to ensure that the targets are forward-looking and not leaning heavily on already achieved reductions. The target must cover all relevant emissions as required by the GHG protocol. So you need to include scope 1 and 2, although companies can exclude a maximum of 5%. And companies must complete a scope 3 screening, as I mentioned. So if scope 3 emissions are 40% or more of your total scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, you are required to set a scope 3 target as well. And that target must cover 2/3 of total scope 3 emissions. And then the ambition level must be consistent with a 2-degree scenario, but companies should pursue effort towards a 1.5-degree target as well. The use of offsets and avoided emissions are not counted as emission reductions towards the company's science-based target. So that was the process for actually developing your target. But setting a science-based target can be done with or without getting the target approved by the Science-Based Target Initiative. We've already gone through this process, so I won't go into too much detail, but basically what I've described is this step. So getting it approved basically just means that you have it validated by a third party that says that, yes, this is approved as a science-based target or a climate change science-aligned target. I also want to touch quickly on this, although it's also been discussed briefly. as I said, so far the Science Based Target Initiative approves targets with a target year of 5 to 15 years into the future. But the initiative is working on a criteria for long-term targets to ensure that corporate net zero targets are consistent with climate science when developing their climate and sustainability strategies. And this is, of course, the development towards the desired state of affairs over here, where anthropogenic emissions are low enough to be balanced by anthropogenic carbon removals. And researchers have explored a wide range of scenarios that limit warming to 1.5 degrees, which have proved that mitigation and atmospheric carbon removals will be necessary. And however, the deployment of negative emission technologies at a large scale is subject to a number of uncertainties and constraints, making it really challenging to create a standard for such target setting. So the Science Based Target Initiative, they launched a paper initiating the work ahead, providing a common understanding about net zero in the corporate sector. And the launch of this should be expected in November of next year. So science-based targets, they offer a plethora of advantages over incremental emission reduction targets, and they boost companies' competitive advantage from our experience in the transition to the low carbon economy. To mention a few benefits here, the science-based targets tend to augment the resilience and competitiveness in the face of climate risk. And planning for a low carbon future is a way of signaling to your stakeholders that you are prepared for what is to come. So companies with science-based targets are often considered lower risk options for the longer term investments, since they can demonstrate that they are planning based on the latest available science and not just setting arbitrary targets that are hard to compare. And then science-based targets also help companies anticipate climate policy and regulatory shift. And I would say maybe especially the new requirements for climate change reporting, which we've already touched on, is a field of incredible developments right now, especially in the EU. And they also help to provide transparent credibility of increasing demand for climate action from stakeholders. So science-based targets are a clear way of showing that you're serious about climate change. And there's really quite a low risk of greenwashing here, because it is based on science, thus pretty easily earning reputational awards, because you're really following the best practice based on an objective standard. And then science-based targets help spur innovation and can move companies towards potentially higher margin products that support emission reductions. And this can in turn place companies at the helm of new technologies and financing options that support long-term gains. I also wanted to use two examples of how science-based targets can be used as a tool to drive climate change action in the value chain. So more and more companies are asking their suppliers to set science-based targets as a part of their own science-based targets. So examples here are ICA-gruppen and Zalando. Both these companies have announced targets to increase the share of their suppliers that have set their own science-based targets. So in this way, companies can really place science and science-based targets in the center of their climate strategy as a catalyst for wider change in their business practices and in their supply chain management. Finally, a few words on communicating science-based targets, as this is a really important area to consider. So once the science-based target has been set, communicating it fully, simply, and clearly is important to accurately inform stakeholders and build that credibility that you're looking for. The Science Based Target Initiative has a separate manual dedicated to the proper communication of SBTs. And it's also, I think somebody else also mentioned this, that it's important to communicate it internally and have that anchoring internally in order to orient employees and management about the plans that the company has for climate action. And this can be done through, for example, quarterly presentations, or including it in policies and reaching out to parts of the company that are particularly important for reducing the target. And this will anchor the emission reduction measures at all levels as well. Just in terms of the criteria here, the target should be revisited each year in line with the GHG protocol. And this is to make sure that the target is updated and still relevant. It also helps companies to make sure that they are on track to reach their target milestones. And then every 5 years, companies should update the target with SBTI if necessary. And that is relevant, for example, if the company has expanded or sold off parts, or there are any structural changes like that. Okay, so my last slide here. I hope I have been able to shed some light on the purpose and value of aligning targets with climate change science. Obviously, if you would like more information, you can just reach out to me. My email is at the top of this presentation. But my key takeaways today is that one, investors and other stakeholders are increasingly expecting companies to align strategy with science. Two, politicians are reacting to the alarming science put forth by the IPCC, and they are really ratcheting up their ambitions quickly, and that could lead to new regulations and requirements from companies, and science-based targets can really help you stay ahead of those types of developments. And that science-based targets demonstrate strategic long-term thinking and leadership, which can reinforce positive reputation with investors and customers. I would also like to note that the growth we see in companies interested in setting corporate net zero targets and long-term targets is an important signal for us to consider of the growing ambition to fight climate change in the economy and from companies. So very positive development there. And with that, I would just like to thank you for your time. And yeah, that was it for me.
Thank you so much, Sophie, and thank you to everyone who participated in this event and to the speakers. We'll now have a Q&A session for the remainder of the session. So as mentioned in the chat, you can write your questions to any of the speakers in the chat box and just mention which company you're from, and I will read out your question, and also mention who your question is directed to. So the first one is, will you give us access to the manual? And who is
okay, so are they referring to the target setting manual, the communication manual, or the criteria and recommendations? I mean, all of it is on the science-based target website, really easily accessible. But you're maybe sending out some material after this, Terry. You could.
Yes, I'll send the recording of the meeting to all the participants.
Yeah, he says all of the above. So okay.
Yeah.
Yes, I have some questions. Nobody else signed up, so I'll ask. My name is Knut. I'm from the UN Global Compact. Thank you so much to all of the speakers. I have a question for Lars. When you do your investment plans and strategy, how important is it that a company has are doing its reporting and have set science-based targets, and how does that affect their value or your interest in investing in them? Could you please go a little bit further into detail as for all of the sustainability and compliance responsibilities here now that can take this with them to their CFO and say, look, what we're doing is important. The investors are looking for this. The investor wanted. If you can just go in a little bit into that. Thank you.
Sure. I mean, it depends. Like currently, it really depends on what sorts of investments we are making and within sort of like what sort of like investment strategy and philosophy we have around it. I wouldn't say that. So, for instance, if we would invest directly in a project or you know, a company that goes as part of our direct investments, I mean, this is a prerequisite, of course. And I think that increasingly we will see that also when it comes to the listed equities and bond space. I mean, companies that are listed on the stock exchange. I think that what we see now for our part is that some of our greener investment products, some of our greener funds, they take this sort of information into consideration and use different rules that either exclude companies or that we overinvest in companies. But I think that this will just become more and more important, and partly also for those financial institutions that will adhere to the science-based targets. A lot of the methodologies that are there relates to target setting, relates to whether or not companies set science-based targets. And it's also options for financial institutions to have engagement targets to influence the companies. So with the sort of like the agenda that we see now, the science-based targets and the EU taxonomy, I think increasingly you will see that the ability to, let's say, convince investors that you are moving in the right way, and as such that you are meeting also the policies that investors have within the climate space, and also that you most likely are resilient to transition risk as well, will probably increasingly moving forward also impact the financing cost and the pricing. I don't want to comment on the pricing that we see today. We are not, I cannot act as a sort of like a financial advisor or anything like that, but I will say that I think it will become more important, and it will affect the financing of companies over time. Yeah, I'm not sure if that answered to the full likeness. Just
great, thank you.
Questions if something was not.
Andreas, can I add something, or is it okay if I add? Yeah, sure. No, about sustainable finance. So this is an area that we have been looking at quite a lot, and it's a bit different subject, but basically having. And that's a recommendation for maybe the companies listening, that, I mean, most companies do have loans, or usually have that. And you can have it, you know, sustainability linked loans, for instance, meaning that you will have a lower interest, and they usually connect the loans with sustainability KPIs, such as, you know, climate targets, and if you have a science-based target or whatever. So it could be something to look into as an argument for having a climate targets, for instance, that you can actually have lower interest at the banks, as an example.
Yeah, I will just echo that. I mean, we see that a lot in the market, and I having a meeting after this call regarding exactly this, and we see more like, I prefer calling it transition loans and transition loans. It's actually called sustainability linked loans, which I think is a little bit the greenwashing name, to be honest. But but we definitely see that, and we also have products like that for loans, where you know, if you do improvements, then you will get a lower interest rate.
Yeah, otherwise you will pay a premium.
Exactly. And what will be even a bigger issue is whether, going a little bit back to the EU, is whether you will have regulation that will somehow lower the capital cost of green. So it's a discussion now for those that know about it, about solvency regulation. I don't think it will go through, but it shows the appetite of the EU to use these sort of measures when it comes to financial regulations to spur the sustainable finance space. And I think, as you say, Andreas, this is increasingly an opportunity actually for companies to tap into cheaper loans, basically.
Exactly.
Okay, so we have a question from Danielle from DNVGL. So she says, both Frederick, Lars, and Elizabeth mentioned that sector-based guidance is needed. What is the Science-Based Target Initiative goal to prepare this? Will there be any special order of priority choosing which sectors guidelines to prepare first? Also, several of you have mentioned that companies will be affected by the EU taxonomy. Are there presently any hard requirements, or is it still only voluntary or recommendations?
You're muted, Fredrik. Fredrik, you're muted.
Fredrik, you have to turn on your microphone. If not, we can't hear you.
Well, maybe I can try in the interim with the last part of the question, which relates to the EU taxonomy. So, are there presently any hard requirements, or is it still only voluntary? Okay, so the requirements of it's not only the EU taxonomy; it's also other regulations that is affected. And for companies, it will be the NFRD reporting directive, the so-called non-financial reporting directive. So I think it's in the year 2022. There will be reporting requirements for companies, and it's still a discussion about which companies will be affected. Like if it's with employees over 500 or below, will it be sort of like different criteria for which will need to report? But basically, companies would then need to report on their adherence to the taxonomy, and the way that sort of like the ecosystem will be put up is that individual companies outside the financial sector will have this reporting requirements, and then that sort of like reporting will be aggregated up for an actor such as KLP, and then we will report on our alignment on the taxonomy, and then we will have another reporting directive, which is called the SFRD, if I'm not mistaken, which will then outline requirements that we need to report to our customer, to our stakeholders, the level of alignment of the products that we have. I just want to make one point about the EU taxonomy, which I also made in my presentation, and that is the fact that we in the financial sector today, we have a very imprecise way of measuring relative emissions. The EU taxonomy will change that, because you will then have requirements on reporting on actual output. That means the stuff that you actually produce, a ton of steel, kilowatt hours, that sort of things. And that enables us over time to develop more scientific benchmarks that allows us to compare an individual company performance to a pathway, a mission trajectory. i.e., we can determine whether a company follows a science-based development. So it's not only about setting a target, but we can also measure over time how well they are meeting their trajectory. So in my view, this will completely change the way that the financial sector have the ability to actually be fairly precise in assessing companies and portfolios performances as it relates to climate.
Yeah, and
should we just say, Fredrik, are you back? Or else I can try.
I think so. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
You hear me now? Nice. I'm sorry. I don't know. Suddenly it disappeared. Another vanishing act. For the sector guidances, sorry, I had to go a little bit quickly through them, but I mean, there already exists quite a lot of sectoral guidance, as we've talked about. We already have for heavy industry, power and energy, real estate, information and communication technology. We have for the transport sector and so on, or part of the transport sector. But as Lars and the others has mentioned, it's very much a work in progress, a lot of them, because I mean, they can be to a certain extent quite technical and they leave room for improvement. So, I mean, once you are committed to a target, this kind of opens up more of an interaction where you can provide feedback to SBTi and kind of participate in continuing the development of these standards, and in the way of creating new ones, we have now, as I showed on the slide, the last slide, we're developing quite a lot of standards at the same time. You have shipping, you have aviation, forestry, land and agriculture, and then we have chemicals and oil and gas. Or perhaps most important one, oil and gas. Me personally have only been involved in the oil and gas work, which I can already say is quite extensive, right? Because as we said, now there's, or the slide you showed, Lars, was quite interesting because you saw those different kind of target setting methodologies. And I could tell you for oil and gas, it's even more diverse methodology. So, I mean, there's a lot of stakeholder consultation and there's a lot of processes going on. So, I mean, we just originally wanted to publish it before the year, but I mean, now it looks like it's going to get postponed a little bit, but we hope that it'll come out next year. Really the other ones, I could say probably the same timeline. I mean, I can't say for certain because I'm not directly involved in any of them, but yeah, they will probably be finished sometime next year. And then they will obviously again be reviewed every now and then and updated. So, I mean, it's very much a work in progress, I could say. But I mean, again, we've got limited working capacity. So it's kind of also a little bit up to the participants in SBTI to kind of take an active role and help to develop the standard and participate in consultations and so on. So, yeah.
Okay, that's perfect. So what I can do right now is, okay, we can just take this one quickly before we round off. So in addition to say in particular, Elizabeth said that Telenor and competitors had a hard time reporting in the same way. Does Science-Based Target Initiative take any actions on gathering representatives from companies and sectors and giving them info seminars in order to give them early guidance?
I think yes, in a way, right, Fredrik?
Yeah, I mean, again, globally, SBTI, I mean, the core team have a limited capacity to do this kind of work. I mean, but we're in a sense doing this now with UNGC and WWF. You could see, like in Sweden, perhaps they've had a longer interaction with SBTI, so they would kind of, the regional office for WWF would kind of act as an SBTI focal point and could kind of create these kind of forums. I think you have consultation processes, you have these kind of feedback mechanisms in the standard development, but I mean, as for training and experience sharing and so on, that's more organized nationally. So, I mean, that's what we're doing right now, and I hope maybe we can continue to do it. So, because it's I think SBTI, like the core team, doesn't have the resources to do so. But once you're starting the process, I mean, SBTI will have more interaction with the companies that are already signing up, and I mean it's not exclusively like a one-way communication. So, I mean, yeah.
Yeah, and can I just say something as well? This is Knut from UN Global Compact. Just this week, there are several Science-Based Target Initiative workshops and meetings in the UN Global Compact networks around the world. So just at the same time as we're doing this, they're doing the same event in the UK. In Asia, they're working hard on it to implement it. So this is very much on the agenda. And this was just the first one in hopefully a long line of reporting and science-based targets events. And if there is interest from our members, we have had a lot of interest for this event. But if there's still interest, we will also go into details, and together with the other partners of the science-based targets, we'll work out a way to facilitate the reporting scheme as much as possible. So then I think we will end there. Terry, will you say the last words?
Yeah. So thank you once again to the speakers and also the participants of the event for making some time for this. As Knut mentioned, we will reach out to you guys with the link where you can rewatch, and if you have any questions, you can reach out to us and we'll be happy to address any questions. So yeah, that is all from us at UN Global Compact Norway. Thank you once again.